Good afternoon to our viewers in Europe and good morning to our viewers in the United States. Hello, my name is Steve Sokol and I'm the president of the American Council on Germany. Thank you for joining us today. In recent months, Iran has faced its most sustained wave of domestic protests in years. An economic collapse and political frustration have driven thousands of people to the streets. Iranian security forces have responded with harsh crackdowns, and the human toll continues to mount amid widespread reports of arrests and daily force against demonstrators. At the same time, rhetoric between Tehran and Washington, D.C. has intensified, and we've even seen a military buildup in recent days. So I think it's fair to say that Iran is in a period of heightened uncertainty, which is shaped by growing domestic pressure and by rising external tensions. To talk about these dynamics, we're joined today by Dr. Cornelius Adebahr, who has worked as an independent consultant and analyst based in Berlin. He focuses mostly on European and global issues, but he's spent time in Iran and has been following the developments there closely. Cornelius, herzlich willkommen.
Vielen Dank, Steve. I'm very happy to be on this call.
Well, it's always great to talk to you, and I'm very much looking forward to our conversation today because there is so much going on in and around Iran at the moment, and I'm hoping that you can help us sort of unpack the different elements. Let's start with the situation in Iran itself. In recent months, Iran has faced some of the most sustained domestic protests in years. And as I said earlier, thousands of people have been driven to the streets. How would you characterize this current wave of protests compared with previous movements that we've followed in Iran? And is this fundamentally a different moment? And if so, what makes it distinct?
Well, I think it's fair to say there is both there is continuity in this protest because it is just the latest in a series of protests and demonstrations that we've seen over the past years. But there is also a new quality to this. And if I just go into some of the bits and pieces that you've already mentioned. So what makes this different is the way it started. It started at the end of December by a strike among the bazaris, which is the traditional merchants in the bazaar of Tehran, because they didn't know which currency, which exchange rate to the dollar they should use, because the dollar was, or the rial was sliding against the US dollar. And the government had just proposed tax rises for the upcoming year. And so they were frustrated with the overall economic situation, with the loss of purchase power. And they went on strike. And this is traditionally a clientele which is conservative and close to the regime. And despite, the politics of the regime, has usually been a backbone of national stability or political stability, so to say. But from these, very confined protests among the bazaris, this spread very quickly to a wider uprising, even one can say, including violence also on the side of the protesters, but obviously no comparison to the violence that the regime had meted out over the coming days. So that's different because it started not as the previous round of protests, which was around women life freedom, so more on the social and human rights side, or again, previous protests, I can think of 2017, 2019, where there were also economic grievances, but more from the poorer side of the population. So that makes it very distinct, especially for those who know a little bit about Iran. The Islamic Revolution in 1978-79 was also driven by the bazaris, and that made the regime very nervous to see this particular segment of the society turn against it.
And so I guess related to that, can you talk a little bit about how the Iranian regime, how the leadership has responded to this, given this sensitivity around the bazaris and the role that they play? Because it seems as if they have really cracked down with a tremendous amount of violence.
That's correct. But it took them a while to come to that point. So for the first couple of days, We're talking end of December until January 8. The regime was more lenient towards the protest. They recognized that there were some grievances. The economic policies of the government have been disputed, not just in recent times, but for years already, ever since the West, under the leadership of the United States, brought in sanctions, economic sanctions against Iran more than a decade ago. It's been a constant battle of the regime to somehow maintain its economic footing. And so at the beginning, they were fairly, they signaled understanding, speaking of legitimate grievances. But this turned very quickly and very harshly, as you already said, into a crackdown. We're speaking of January 8, January 9, when the regime started to cut off the internet, so that both people couldn't coordinate, and not just the internet, but also mobile phone. People couldn't coordinate inside the country, and there wouldn't be any pictures, videos, etc., being sent to the outside of the country. And what we know now, and what we could only guess at the time, was this was a military-style crackdown, which was then executed. We know of 10,000s of deaths. We can estimate that it was a couple of 10,000, so maybe up to 30,000 deaths in those 3 days alone, under the cover of a near complete blackout. Again, this is something we haven't seen before. I mean, the constant blackout on the internet and the mobile phone, and also, as I said, the military style crackdown. We know that the regime in Iran doesn't care about civilian lives, doesn't care about the lives of its people, but this has simply reached a new level. This even compared to some executions which we saw in the late 1980s, towards the end of the Iran-Iraq war, they reached only, so to say, I'm not trying not to be cynical, they only reached a couple of thousands. Here, this is way beyond what we've known from anywhere before in Iran.
And what's the status of the protests and the demonstrations right now?
From what we know, and this is again not a lot, because communication is still being hampered. From what we know, the protests have died down. I mean, for the use of force, the sheer use of force that the regime has deployed, going with militias, with the army, with machine guns, going through civilian areas, and killing people on the streets. This has really brought this particular protest wave to a halt, one has to say. So people are now recovering from a shock, from a trauma. People are trying to find their family members, their loved ones. They still have to pay what is called a bullet fine. They have to pay to receive the bodies so that they can bury them. If they cannot pay, they have to sign a declaration that the lost family member was a member of the security services, so that the regime can sustain its narrative that these were violent protesters which were instigated by foreign powers, and that it was the majority were security personnel who died. This is the official narrative. And now, I mean, with forcing people to mostly falsely admit to their family members being part of the security services, they even have some proof, as they would say. So right now, this is the situation inside the country, but it remains volatile. The potential for protests is still there, and with everything going on outside of the country, speculation around a U.S. military strike, which we may touch upon later. But this, of course, sustains the anxiety both on the side of the regime, but also the potential for a renewed uprising among the people.
Somebody just submitted a question, speaking about the official line, about where this number of 30,000 deaths comes from. And I guess, in addition to that how has that number been verified, or has it been verified?
Well, the 30,000 have not been verified in full. These are estimates. I mean, coming from broadly media organizations outside of Iran. When I said around 10,000, that's a verified number. There is a US-based Iranian human rights organization which very meticulously and very conservatively tries to verify names and people and also the consent from the relatives that their names can be published. This is why there is no. Oh, sorry, there is also an official death toll. The regime has admitted thousands of deaths. But on the more truthful side, there is a slow process of incremental increase of these verified numbers simply because it is hard for these civil society organizations to, put names to people, to photographs, to footage that they receive. And then acquire the consent of relatives that names may be published. That's why these official numbers, they are down to single digits, so that they know exactly what they can prove. But the more frightening estimates going into the tens of thousands, they are very likely to be verified at some point. But as I said, it just takes a lot of time.
I mean, this is obviously a tremendous crackdown that the Iranian regime is engaged in. And, I guess one of the questions that I think many people are asking is how, this continued repression may play out and whether it couldn't sort of run the risk of greater instability domestically if it goes on for too long and if it goes too far. Are you seeing any signs about how the regime might be recalibrating its response, and also how the protesters, you've talked about the fact that they're sort of pulling back and recovering from the first shock and trauma. But are you picking up on anything else that's going on the ground?
Well, I think here we are in the business of scenario building to an
Yeah.
extent. If I look back at the protest history, and I mean, I mentioned already a couple of dates: 2017, 2019, 20, and then 2022 with the Women Life Freedom Movement. These were really sustained protests which lasted for a couple of weeks at least. And which also saw a violent reaction from the regime with hundreds and on some occasions thousands of deaths on the side of the protesters. So the pattern is very clear. As soon as protests become dangerous for the regime, as soon as they threaten the legitimacy of the Islamic Republic or indeed of the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, then the regime finds a red line being crossed and it will revert to violence. And they had no qualms going after their people this time again. What you can see is that, especially with this with a huge crackdown this time around, that the regime would want to draw a line, not just the red line that I crossed, but they said, okay, we've had enough. We will show you that we do anything to defend the Islamic Republic. Some have compared this to the Tiananmen incident, the protests in Beijing in China in 1989, where you could think of the events both in Central and Eastern Europe, the Velvet Revolution in some countries, but also basically the fall of the Iron Curtain in Central and Eastern Europe. And at the same time, you had a similar pro-democracy movement in China among students largely, which was then again violently cracked down upon in the summer of 1989. And this is and we don't know how many people died there. Again, a couple of thousands possibly, never verified, never fully verified. But this was the moment where the Communist Party in China said, okay, we're not going to tolerate gradual change. We're not going to move towards liberal democracy. We will stay a communist one-party state. And to an extent, it's been long known that the supreme leader Ali Khamenei he feared the example of Gorbachev, who introduced reforms and then
Mhm.
only got kicked out of office, but the entire Soviet Union was dissolved. And he cherished or admired possibly the Chinese example, where the Communist Party was bold enough to simply not care about civilian life and manifest its claim to power. And this is possibly, from the regime point of view, this is a moment where they said, enough is enough. We will not tolerate protests. We will not tolerate changes to the Islamic Republic. And there were, I mean, we know very little around defections, for example, from the security
Right.
apparatus. There were one or two diplomats I learned that left their post, but I mean, they were already outside of the country. Inside the country, most of the people who benefit from the regime, they feel they are with their back against the wall and they will defend the regime because they know they have nothing afterwards. So
So I
this,
was going to ask you, if you're seeing, unity within the regime, or if you're seeing some signs of internal strain, and some crumbling of that sort of solidarity.
well, definitely more unity, and what the latest developments have been also an apprehension of opposition, or not opposition. There is no opposition in Iran. I mean, there is no legal opposition, but of what are called reformist politicians. They have been put into prison because they dared speak around constitutional reform, which means a change of the Islamic Republic, or the system of the Islamic Republic. And so they have been apprehended in recent days, people who were in office 10, 15 years ago. So, deserved politicians from the Islamic Republic. But the moment they again cross a line to say, well, couldn't we have a different political system? That's where they go into prison. So the regime is actually building on unity, on coherence, and enforcing it in quite a harsh way.
Before we sort of switch gears and move in another direction, somebody just submitted a question that sort of looks back a little bit further and tries to compare the current moment with previous moments, and would like to know how these current protests compare with protests against the Shah in terms of the numbers, the size of the protests and the demonstrations, but also in terms of the objectives.
That's a very good question and an important point. So we still haven't reached the numbers that we saw in 1978, 1979, when I mean, hundreds of thousands of people took to the street, when there was a broad coalition of people protesting against the Shah. And where there was, and that's one of the key elements, where there was an Ayatollah in exile, Khomeini, who was first in Iraq and then in France, and who could rely on a network of clerics inside the country, and had, so to say, structures inside the country. And that's a key distinction. So when you just look at the size of the protests, this was sustained, and in all the most recent one was sustained, and in all provinces, so countrywide. But it wasn't the millions that took to the streets, both or neither in 1979 nor in 2009, which is again a historic mark with what is called the Green Movement, the Green Wave, where there was already some opposition protests, but people weren't demanding a change of the Islamic system. They were demanding the end of a vote fraud. They wanted the votes to be counted correctly and see a different candidate win the presidency. So that was millions taking to the streets for over 6 months of sustained protests. So the numbers aren't there yet, but apparently the regime felt threatened enough, and in particular, and here I'm already going a little bit into what's going on outside of Iran. It was the son of the former Shah, Pahlavi, Reza Pahlavi, a U.S. resident. He had called on people to protest, in particular on January 8th, and then people turned out in high numbers. And this most likely, we don't know the exact reasoning, but this most likely also continued to the severe crackdown, because for the first time they saw that there is someone outside of the country, like the Ayatollah Khomeini back in the days, now the son of the former Shah. And he can mobilize people inside the country. And this is when the regime said, okay, that's too much. We need to intervene. So in that sense, in particular to 1978, 1979, I would say, despite some parallels, like the Bazaris being on the side of the protesters, we don't have the same kind of potential inside the protest movement, inside neither in the diaspora nor in the country. And obviously, we also have a very different international constellation of outside forces, having an interest in what's going on in Iran.
Thank you for bringing up Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi because I actually did want to talk about him next. You were just in Munich on the sidelines of the Munich Security Conference, and there was a huge demonstration of, I think, over 250,000 people who sort of took to the streets against the government in Iran. The Crown Prince had called this a global day of action, and so he's mobilized people domestically in Iran, as you talked about earlier in January, but also, of course, on an occasion like that. How is the rest of the world sort of responding? And we'll get to the United States in just a moment, but particularly in Berlin, on the sidelines of the Munich Security Conference, what's the German reaction been to these developments in Iran?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start with Reza Pahlavi, and you'll forgive me for pointing out that I don't call him a crown prince because Iran isn't a monarchy. I call him the son of the former Shah.
Okay.
He's a citizen and not a royal. But he is also, I mean, he has some. I mean, he has lots of supporters, obviously inside the diaspora. He may have some supporters inside the country. That's always hard to tell. I mean, his name was shouted at some of the demonstrations, but I mean, so we saw videos of that, but we don't know the true extent of the support he has. The question there is, I mean, he has ended up being the only figure among the diaspora opposition who is somehow relatable at the moment. 3 years ago, 4 years ago, 3.5 to be precise, when with the Woman Life Freedom Movement, there was still half a dozen of prominent opposition figures coming together, including in Georgetown and Georgetown University, and trying to form a kind of board of outside opposition. He was one among a couple, but even there, he didn't manage to somehow unite this group. Some would say he and his supporters were part of why the group fell apart. So in that sense, it's hard to say whether he could actually lead the resistance movement or the opposition. Notwithstanding these kind of difficulties, he's also accepted by some policymakers inside, also in Germany. MPs of the German Bundestag meet with him in Munich at the security conference, and they see him as the kind of figure that could potentially unite the opposition, despite my own reservations that I would have. The reaction of Germany has been mostly, I mean, obviously condemning the violence. That's what the German government always does. But it was also more substantially, Germany was behind a push by the Europeans to list the IRGC, which is the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, as a terrorist organization. That's something that the United States had already done under the first Trump administration. The Europeans were wary, or were for a long time wary of doing that. And now there was a majority also among the EU member states, and the German government, since the Woman Life Freedom Movement had changed its position, being more in favor, and now finally getting the last holdouts to also do that. The question is, how much will that change? Will that influence the events on the ground? But at least at the symbolic level, it is something where the EU has now said literally, this is a terrorist organization. It's not a partner that we can work with.
I mean, this really sort of ties these two themes together in a sense, right? I mean, there are lots of questions about what regime change could look like in Iran and what might lead to it. Of course, it carries huge risks, including further domestic fragmentation, possibly even the risk of a full-scale civil war in the country. And at the same time, you have a lot of actors, a lot of players sort of standing on the sidelines and watching what's going on there. In addition to the measures that you were talking about, I think that the EU has really tried to urge de-escalation and has recommended using sanctions, has even offered support for civil society organizations within Iran. And it wasn't that long ago that the German defense minister, Boris Pistorius, at a press conference said that the Iranian people, quote, don't want regime change forced by external powers, end quote. Fast forward to the situation today and the way in which things are unfolding. Do you think that the Iranian people would welcome external powers intervening and supporting a regime change?
Well, that's a hard question to answer, but I will try to frame it in a way that up until the end of last year, I would have said no. Iranians want to do this by themselves, by and large, and in huge majorities. Um, Especially given the track record of forced regime change, not just in the region. I mean, thinking of Iraq or Syria for that matter, or Libya, but also I mean the very Iranian history of a CIA instigated coup in the 1950s. Earlier, the Shah was brought back to power. So Iran has seen its share of foreign meddling, and so there has been a constant of not wanting to have regime change forced upon them. Given the violent crackdown and the sheer impossibility to imagine change coming from within, I understand that some people would say, okay, at least help us. You probably all saw the tweets or the truths put out by the U.S. president saying, help is on its way. He pledged support to the protesters, but that's 4 weeks ago, 5 weeks ago. So there was some willingness to accept some kind of outside intervention to at least tip the balance. This moment probably has passed. There are no protests ongoing, which an outside intervention may support. But that's where things become difficult. What exactly would be, the aims of? I mean, we're only talking about a U.S. military intervention, maybe Israel, but there is no other country currently pondering a military intervention. So, what exactly would be the aims of that military intervention? I just saw before our conversation started that President Trump has said he's mulling a limited strike against Iran. Well, how does that change the situation on the ground? So in that sense, I've been more careful in saying Iranians don't want outside intervention because they see it as one opportunity to at least get something, some change inside the country. But at the same time, they probably also feel let down because they were promised help when they were taking to the streets, when they were killed in huge numbers, but help then didn't arrive. So in that sense, it is really something where it's hard to say what exactly could they expect from this. Look at Venezuela, just changing one person at the top, and now possibly also freeing some political prisoners doesn't really provide for freedom, democracy, and the breathing space that Iranians long for.
Mm-hmm. I want to come to the U.S. in just a second, but before we do that, since we've been talking about what the outside world can actually do, what it can deliver, and we touched on the word sanctions. One of our viewers asks whether sanctions have become counterproductive because, in light of the economic difficulties and currency problems, sanctions actually give the regime a chance to blame the West for the poor economy.
Which is true, and it's not just that the regime has a narrative or a justification to blame the West. I mean, it can do that anyway, and it has been doing it over 47 years. But the sanctions, as we've seen, have also contributed to a hardening of the regime, to an entrenchment of regime elements inside the country. For example, if trade is banned, as it has been, for more than a decade now, it means that the actors close to the Revolutionary Guards, which control the ports and the airports, which have huge conglomerates in infrastructure, in construction. They are the ones, doing the smuggling of any banned products, and they are the ones receiving state contracts. So the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guards, is not just it's usually called the Praetorian Guard of the regime. They exist in addition to the regular army. Their main task is to defend the Islamic Republic, not territorial defense, but ideological defense, so to say. But they are also an important economic player. They have become over the years because there was no more regular business to be done. And so in that sense, some at the height of the protest in early January, I heard some people, German policymakers, say, "Wow, look at this! The sanctions have worked. People take to the streets. They are so poor and let down. They take to the streets, and now they want to overthrow the regime." But 4 weeks later, you could just as well say, well, first of all, it's quite harsh to put sanctions on a people, on a country, until they are so poor that they want to throw off their regime. But at the same time, they again haven't managed to do that. They are worse off than before. And people who have to work 2 or 3 jobs just to maintain a living, they don't have time to organize, to work for political groups, to work in civil society, to do charity. They simply don't have the time and the breathing space for that. So sanctions is, in the end, a very blunt tool, and we can see a lot of detrimental effects of the sanctions over time. And they haven't really, some say they brought Iran to the table for the nuclear negotiations in 2013-15 when the deal was signed. But the most recent set of sanctions has just created misery and some protests, but hasn't brought down the regime so far.
And it's also built on sort of years of economic isolation as it is, right? So this is a tool. I think your description of it as a blunt instrument makes sense, is that this is a tool that is maybe not as impactful as it once was, and that its power has been reduced over time, or has been diminished over time.
Well, that's the other side. You're right to point this out. At a moment when the United States, the Europeans, and China and Russia were more or less putting out this international sanctions architecture, and now I'm talking about the early 2010s, which were targeted, which had a clear aim in the sense of getting Iran to negotiate and reduce its nuclear program. This is where sanctions had, the limited success that they had. They did have it. There was a conclusion of the nuclear negotiations with the JCPOA, with the nuclear deal. Now it is mainly U.S. sanctions which have remained, and China and Russia are engaging in sanctions evasion themselves. Russia is now sanctioned itself after the Ukraine invasion. China is supporting both these countries, Russia and Iran, in evading sanctions. The Europeans, put out the latest batch of IRGC sanctions, but don't have across the board economic sanctions like the United States. So obviously the power diminishes if you have major players, Russia, China, but also regional actors that are working against it. That's just a fact.
One more viewer question who points out that there are large Azeri and Kurd minorities in Iran, and the viewer is curious what you might know about their views toward a potential regime change, and what would be desirable for them if the current leadership is ousted.
Well, in particular, the Kurdish population of Iran has been, for decades, a stronghold of resistance, of opposition work, of working towards an alternative to the Islamic Republic, which to an extent has enabled the regime to paint them as seditionists. There's even, if the Kurdish population of Iran does not, maybe they want more regional autonomy, but they don't necessarily want to secede from Iran. But this has been the narrative from the central authorities, that any kind of protests of concerns coming from what are called the peripheral regions of the country. For one reason or another, most ethnic minorities live on the outer edges of Iran. The Kurds to the northwest, the Arab population to the west, the Baluchis to the east, to Afghanistan and Pakistan, the Azeris in the north. So there is always this idea that minorities are driven by outside powers, or they are instigated by outside powers, or they're driven by the wish to secede. So that's the regime narrative, which is very convenient for them. So these parts of the population, they have long clamored for more freedoms, for a less strict Islamic Republic. But the fear probably is that if we see a toppling of the regime, that there won't be soon enough a joint endeavor, a joint proposal for how Iran could reconstitute itself, politically speaking, and that this would be then the moment where the seditionists, or the more nationalist-minded in these minority areas, where they come to the fore. Maybe they are those who have more ready access to weapons. I'm really talking about a breakup scenario now. They may be fed weapons from the outside, from other groups. So the scenario really is that if the regime is toppled and nothing replaces it in a very short term, then this may just fall apart, because then the Kurds will say, we already mentioned Reza Pahlavi, but the return of the monarchy is not what Kurds have taken to the streets for decades now. Same for the Arabs, the Arab part of Iran, or for the Baluchis. So that's the danger of simply toppling the regime, hoping that some alternative will keep the country together, but then finding yourself in a very different reality.
Yeah. So, Cornelius, let's come back to the role of the United States and what's going on right now. I mean, obviously, in recent weeks, we've seen Washington putting pressure on Tehran, and more recently, we've seen a rapid buildup of U.S. military forces in the Middle East. We don't know what will happen next, but I'm sort of asking you to think a little bit about what you might expect from the U.S. in the short term. Are we likely to see this as being the creation of a Drohkulisse, right, or a sort of a threat that's there that might facilitate diplomatic action and endeavors, or do you think conflict could be right around the corner?
Well, I would hope that it's only the former, but I fear the latter is more likely, and that's because from how I read the president's tweets during the protest, he was ready to use force at the time. Not really to support the protesters, maybe, or to support them in the way they had wished for support. Some of them had wished, but he seems to have been ready to strike at the time, and he was most likely advised by his militaries that the United States wasn't yet in a position. There wasn't an aircraft carrier group in the Gulf. Much of the assets that the United States had moved to the Caribbean and to Venezuela were still there. So there wasn't a readiness really to strike. There was also probably a concern on the side of Israel at that particular moment that a very limited strike, the capabilities that the United States had at the moment in the area, that they would endanger Israel more than they would hurt the regime, because the Islamic Republic would probably strike at Israel. And so it's notable that the United States is also bringing air defenses into the region now to protect its own assets, but also possibly to protect Israel. The Arab neighboring states have been against the military intervention in early January as much as they are against it today. Israel seems to have shifted its position now that the buildup is much more sustained, and there seems to be more planning going into this. So it's not just a shot from the hip to do something during the protests, but it seems to be a more thought through campaign that is possible now. But again, looking at the military buildup over the past weeks, the announcements from the White House, looking at how the what is called the 12-day war of the last summer unfolded, first with Israel taking the initiative, but then the United States coming in. I can imagine, at least the limited strikes that the president
Mhm.
talked about today being executed if he put a deadline for the talks, expecting results in 15 days. So if that doesn't materialize, there is a high likelihood of US military action. What level, I cannot yet say.
Right. I mean, this is obviously something we all have to be watching, but I think it's also important to point out that this probably has a lot more to do with stopping or slowing Iran's nuclear ambitions than it does with supporting civil society on the ground in Iran.
Well, for sure, yes. I mean, the rhetoric has changed in that regard. Whereas in January, the president said, I'm helping the protesters. Now it is more about, well, probably, no, how can I say, building up, so to say, the rhetoric of saying this is, we mean it when we say military intervention is a possibility. But it is also something which would probably be very limited. No one wants the United States to occupy a huge country in the Middle East. So this is probably not on the table. But the consequences of what exactly would Iran do in response, how much of their own boisterous rhetoric would they put into practice? That's of course an unknown. But yeah, we have to reckon with that distinct possibility of at least a limited strike.
How is the policy community and how are governments in Berlin and Brussels sort of responding to this new threat dimension and this posturing of Washington?
Well, I mean, on the one hand, they are actually trying to de-escalate as much as possible. I think the listing, the terrorist listing of the IRGC was also a sign to the United States saying, we are on par now when it comes to sanctioning Iranian officials and putting pressure on the regime. There is, negotiations going on, not just between Iran and the United States through Qatar, but obviously also the Europeans here. It's the E3, United Kingdom, France, and Germany as the foremost Iran diplomatic partners. They are also talking to their US counterparts to, on the one hand, ensure that if there is a nuclear deal, it has some substance and some teeth, because ironically, the worry is among the Europeans. I mean, the nuclear deal from 2015 is technically gone. I mean, there is still a document one could revive, but in all practicalities, it's hard to do so. But the fear is that whatever nuclear deal may come out of the current negotiations is weaker than what was achieved in 2015, simply because there are a few people inside, say, the US government having the depth of knowledge and the willingness to work on the details of what exactly should happen to the centrifuges, how exactly can the enriched uranium be shipped out of Iran, which kind of international supervisory mechanism, which has some legitimacy and will be accepted by Iran, is possible to install. So that is one worry. The Europeans are talking to the Americans around this idea of what could be a potential nuclear agreement. And thirdly, and you've mentioned this already in passing, there is some attempts among the Europeans to support civil society or the civilian population inside Iran as much as this is possible, to see how in the mid to long term one can sustain an element of citizenship that should not regime change, but should change come to Iran, which way ever, that then there is some element inside the society which can pick up the mantle and work towards an alternative political system. But this is, as I say, this ranges from emergency aid to the more long-term civil society support. But it would fall apart the moment we have a military intervention. So that's why the Europeans are always they're working on these three fronts at the same time, so to say.
I mean, obviously there are lots of variables and lots of moving parts, and even while you were speaking just now, I received sort of two conflicting messages from viewers. One saying, is this a case where Trump might chicken out in the end? He's building this threat to try to increase his leverage in the negotiations, but might not carry through. Someone else noted that just as we were getting started with our conversation, it was announced that the Supreme Court ruled against Trump's tariffs, and that person suggested that maybe Trump is now more likely to launch some sort of attack as soon as this weekend to try to divert attention away from the Supreme Court decision. And this is something that we've obviously seen before, the flooding the zone, but also trying to distract people's attention from one issue by focusing it on another. Obviously, something that we'll have to see how it unfolds. Do you want to say anything to that, or?
Well, I mean, no. I mean, I cannot say, and some of you are much closer to those decision-making centers in DC, possibly. But I mean, that's all valid speculation. But we cannot know, whether this will be a big strike or a small strike, whether it will be a strike at all. We know that President Trump did chicken out in the past, and some would say he chickened out in early January when he pledged support to the protesters and then didn't provide it. So yes, unfortunately, there are a lot of moving parts, in particular on the White House side.
I mean, historically, Europe has played a mediating role between Washington and Tehran. And I wonder if, under the current circumstances, given where we are right now, there are any diplomatic tools that you see that are sort of available to decision makers, opinion leaders in Berlin or also in Brussels, that can help navigate this current situation, or even tools that the Europeans might have that the Americans don't.
Well, I mean, diplomacy is a tool that the Americans hardly have, I would like to say, because there haven't been diplomatic relations with Iran since 1980, since 1979, 1980. So that's the one avenue that the Europeans can always provide. And despite having hardened its position on Iran, again, for a number of factors, the crackdown, this human rights situation is one, but the Iranian support for Russia in its war against Ukraine, early drone deliveries early in the full-scale war were a decisive factor on the battleground in Ukraine. So that's and then there is what we call transnational repression. So the Iranian regime going after European citizens, Iranians living in Europe, from the diaspora, from the opposition. So the Europeans have by and large moved to a position where probably in terms of, I'm not going to say enmity with Iran, but opposition to the Islamic Republic, to a position where the United States was maybe 10 years ago, a very hard and not conciliatory position. The trouble is the US position has changed to the extent that it has become more erratic now. We don't know
Right.
whether Trump would like to strike a deal and do business with Iran and leave the regime intact, or whether he would go for some kind of major military intervention. We simply don't know. Both are a possibility. and that makes it hard for the Europeans to react to that. But they can talk to Iran. They have maintained diplomatic relations despite the pressure which some Europeans put on their governments to say, okay, given the horrors that we saw in the crackdown, this is a regime we cannot talk to. We must close our embassies. We must withdraw our ambassadors. The governments have been fairly steadfast in saying, no, this is the channel, the one channel that we want to keep open. We want to talk, be able to talk to Iran. We want to be able to talk to the neighbors. I mean, Turkey plays a key role besides Israel and the Arab Gulf countries. So the Europeans can bring this kind of, this wider perspective to the table for sure.
Mm-hmm. I mean, they can bring a wider perspective, but I think it's also important to mention that within or among the EU member states, there's not always been full consensus on how to address Iran or how to address the situation there. And so as we navigate this point, it's important to look at where there is a sense of agreement, but also where there are differences in terms of the threat perception and what sort of frictions that might create within Europe. Where do you see the greatest alignment, and where are there differences that may be important?
And you're very diplomatic in saying that they haven't always agreed, as if they had, agreed most of the time. No, but truth be told, when I say the European position has hardened, it means that the differences also between the Europeans have lessened. So Germany is a case in point. Germany is now maybe the number one target of the Iranians when you look at Europe. So obviously the United States and Israel stand out as the big two evils, and then Great Britain has been a long-standing enemy, or from an Iranian perspective, but now the Germans, with a change of position in response to the Woman Life Freedom movement, the hardening of the German position, Germany has really been singled out as one of the enemies of the Islamic Republic, as seen in Tehran. And I'm saying this because that was, of course, key in order to get to the consensus also around the listing of the IRGC. Italy, another country which has maintained business ties with Iran, which was more on the side of finding political compromises, also went along with the listing. So the Europeans have become much more coherent to an extent in the sense of how they can put pressure on Iran. Will that suffice? It's hard to say, but it is something where you see a more unified position of the Europeans and trying to exert a pressure on Iran.
I mean, having said that, where, and I don't know if there's really an easy answer to this, but where do you see Berlin's biggest concerns when it comes to the situation in Iran? Is it sort of the social situation and human rights? Is it regional stability overall? Is it Tehran's nuclear ambitions? I mean, what is the biggest threat that Berlin sees?
Yeah, thank you. One thing that I had meant to say in response to your previous question, which concerns the Europeans and leads to different national approaches, so to say, is the presence of citizens inside Iran. I mean, the kind of hostages being taken. So France, Italy, Spain, Germany have always been careful in alienating Iran, the Islamic Republic, because they fear for citizens which have been apprehended by the Iranian regime.
Mm-hmm.
So this was something I needed to add to my previous response. So that's obviously a concern for European governments, but the main concern would be one of a scenario where you basically have an implosion of the regime and of the country, the kind of civil war, Syria times 10 scenario, where for whatever reason, be it internally purely or with external help, the leadership is, decapacitated, taken out. There is a vacuum. Maybe the Revolutionary Guards, as the strongest military actor with also an inside domestic angle, they will take over. But then, say, peripheral regions, the Kurds, the Arabs, the Baluchis, they would say this is no longer the country we want to stay in. This is a military dictatorship, and they would take up arms, and you would see a regional conflagration. I think this is this has been the nightmare scenario all these years, which is also one of the reasons why European governments who are, I mean, geographically much closer to Iran, who would have to deal with the regional fallout, including possible refugee streams coming from Iran. This is why they've been careful in jumping the gun, if you allow the metaphor, and supporting violent protests this time around, or 3 years ago, or 5 years ago. So the idea of Iran falling apart and becoming a black hole. I mean, this is very theatrical to an extent, but at the same time, it's a realistic scenario. We've seen it in other countries before. As I said, the Syria or the Libya scenario, Syria from 12, 13 years ago, not the most recent one. That's the main worry. And that's then you can add the kind of nuclear material which still remains in the country falling into the wrong hands. But here we are, or maybe some panic attacks by the Iranians against Israel, with the devastating effect that would have. So that's where European policymakers really get the sweat on their forehead.
So as we come to a close, I have sort of two closing questions. I mean, one is, obviously Iran is in a very volatile situation, and this is true both domestically but also internationally. I think if there are military strikes, whether they're limited strikes or more extensive strikes, it will have a huge impact on what's happening on the ground in Iran at the moment. But if we assume that there aren't going to be any military strikes, and I don't know how realistic an assumption that is, in the coming weeks, in the coming months, what are you watching in Iran itself that would give you a sense of whether the situation is stabilizing or whether the situation is escalating, or entering a fundamentally new phase in terms of possible regime change, in terms of the protests, and the way in which the Iranian regime is responding to that?
Well, I think the main a couple of things to watch. One is regime coherence. So whether there are any cracks to be seen either at the political level or at the military security apparatus level, because and that's something we haven't seen yet.
Right.
We heard reports of the regime forces actually moving in around January 8, January 9 with decisiveness, that they really felt this is where we have to stand our ground against these protesters. And we heard little of defections inside the country. So regime coherence is one, and then a subset to that is obviously how long will the supreme leader live? I mean, biologically speaking, he's very frail and he's not in good health. But if he continues to live for a few more years, this may stabilize. If he dies within the next couple of weeks or months, I mean, for whatever reason, that's obviously an opening. The second thing to watch is opposition coherence, or the emergence of some coherent opposition. Whether this is through what I call the reformists, so the establishment opposition, or whether it is actual civil society / minority groups forming some kind of proposal. And the third one, I would say, is the economic situation. Is there some stabilization through maybe sanctions relief? Does the regime find the tools to stabilize the economy so that they can at least offer something to their people? Say this has been a harsh period. I mean, I'm not meaning this seriously myself, but they can say to their people, this has been a harsh period.
Yeah.
We had to fight the enemy. From the Iranian perspective, this is still part of the war that started last summer. which is also why they feel they can justify a military style crackdown. So we've seen through a rough patch here, but this is the kind of path that we can offer to the future. If they come to that point, they may feel that they have survived that challenge. That's something that I would watch.
Thank you, Cornelius. And then last question, somebody who's currently watching asked whether the post-Assad Syria provides any lessons for how to manage regime change, since we've been talking about the possibilities of regime change. Do you think that there's anything there that one can draw on in terms of things to do or not to do?
Um, Well, I think the situation is still very different because Syria has been in a civil war for over a decade before coming to that
Yeah.
point where there was enough kind of internal resistance and even military buildup on the side of the rebels that they could take on that they could take on the government forces. There was outside support for this. This is not the situation where we are in Iran, and I fear that even entering a civil war, as bloody as it already was in Syria, a civil war in Iran would be even more devastating. I don't take much solace from the Syrian example. I hope for Syria that it will stabilize the way it is right now, but I wouldn't want the same to happen to Iran.
Yeah. Well, Cornelius, herzlichen Dank. Many thanks for sharing your insights. I certainly learned a lot over the last hour, and I hope our viewers did as well. It's always great to talk with you. Many, many thanks.
Thank you very much, Steve. Thanks to all who tuned in for this session, and I look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.